All right, a very good afternoon to you all. Thank you very much for being here. Apologies for about 10 minutes late. That's due to movement from one office to another. So apologies here. Today we are very happy to have two very prominent speakers here as part of Tibet Expert Talk series that we hold occasionally. And both of them that I will give a brief introduction on are highly respected in their own field of expertise. And the format of the talk today is the two of them will give 30 minutes of talk each, followed by 20 minutes of Q&A, and both of their talk will be led by two discussants from Tibet Policy Institute, two research fellows here. And before we go into it, please allow me to read out a brief introduction of the two speakers so that at least we will have some background to who are the speakers, why are they here, and what are the topics that they're going to read on. And now that you are looking at it, so what we have provided here is, in order to restrict consumption of time, we have provided the profile of our researchers so that we will not introduce them here. And also to all the speakers, the participants here, we have provided brief introduction of the two speakers here with the program here as well. The first speaker we have is Cheng Lei, if I have said it right. She's an Australian-Chinese journalist and a news presenter with a distinguished career spanning more than 2 decades in business and international reporting. She was born in China, later moved to Australia, and became Australian citizen in 2003. Lei began her professional career in finance, working as an accountant for Cadbury Schweppes, I guess that is how it's spelled, and later as a business analyst for ExxonMobil in Australia and Yunnan Inmo Logistics in China. In 2002, she transitioned to journalism after successfully joining CCTV, now CGTN, where her expertise in finance enabled her to report on complex economic and social development, business development with clarity and authority. She later served as CNBC's China correspondent in Shanghai and Singapore before returning to Beijing to continue her work with CCTV. Over the years, Lei has moderated and hosted several high-level international forums, including the Australia-China Business Award 2013, the APEC Women Leadership Forum 2014, and the Norway Asia Business Summit 2019, engaging global leaders on issues of trade, economic policy, and international relations. In August 2020, this is important. During heightened diplomatic tensions between Australia and China, Ms. Lei was detained in Beijing on national security allegations and held for over 3 years of presence, on which Lei highlighted yesterday at the 10th March speech. Following sustained diplomatic effort by the Australian government, she was released on October 2023 and returned to Australia. She now serves as the president at Sky News Australia and continues to provide thoughtful analysis on global affairs, economic policy, and press freedom. That's a brief introduction of the first speaker. And then coming to the second speaker, Badiu Cao, if I said it right. Badiu Cao is again a Chinese-born Australian political cartoonist, visual artist, human rights activist, widely recognized for his bold and provocative artwork that challenged censorship, authoritarianism, and human rights abuses in China. He was born in China and later migrated to Australia, and now he is an Australian citizen. He studied law at the East China University of Political Science and Law before moving to Australia in 2009, where he later became, okay, that's already done. Badiu Cao began publishing political cartoons in 2011 and soon gained international recognition for his sharp critique of propaganda and authoritarian governance. His artworks have appeared in leading international media outlets such as BBC, CNN, China Digital Times, and Hong Kong Free Press. Over the years, Badiu Cao has held solo exhibitions in cities including Warsaw, Prague, Russia, and Melbourne, and has participated in major group exhibitions across Europe and Australia. His work addresses critical global issues such as Tibet, Uyghur crisis, Hong Kong democratic movement, and the legacy of Tiananmen Square crackdown. His contribution to art and human rights advocacy has earned him several prestigious awards, including the Václav Havel Prize, the Courage the current in Cartoonist Award, the Cheng Lei Award, and the Amnesty International Australian Media Award. Currently an editorial cartoonist for The Age, and the Sydney Morning Herald. Badiu Cao continues to speak internationally on freedom of expression and the role of art in resisting authoritarianism. That's the brief introduction to this figure. And giving a brief background to the topic, that why the significance of it is that understanding China's system of political repression, the voices of resistance through art and journalism. I think this is very important. Given their background, this is their expertise, this is their field of many years of experience, and something that I strongly feel that we can learn from, or we can at least have some understanding. So we are looking forward to hearing from you the system of political repression in China and how we can resist them through art and journalism. With this, I'll give it, hand over to Dalai Lama.
Welcome to TBI. So myself, my background in journalism, so I give you a brief about Tibetan journalism as a gist. So we often call that media is the fourth pillar of democracy that keeps the false and truth alive, right? So it also checks the power in critical condition or in exact condition. Is a balance between the power. So in China, that pillar is under immense pressure. The freedom of expression is tightly controlled, or you can say it doesn't exist at all. So independent journalists is suppressed and truth is buried under the layers of Chinese censorship. Moreover, the propaganda dominates the information space and runs the show in China. So yet, even in such conditions, in Tibet, citizen journalism shown remarkable bravery. For example, following the around 160 Tibetan self-demolitions inside Tibet, they have risked their own lives and smuggled out news, photos, and their messages to outside the world. Tibetan diaspora journalists, civil societies, and government efforts helped to ensure that the voice of those inside Tibet were not silenced, and supported advocacy efforts globally. It's a crystal clear that their courage reminds us of power of journalism to give voice to the voiceless and to challenge repression with truth. With that, I warmly welcome Cheng Lei to speak, understanding China's system of political repression and the roles of resistance to journalism. Please.
Thank you so much for that generous introduction. I will tell you what I know a lot about, which is how the media system operates in China. Having started there in 2002 with what used to be known as CCTV-9, and then to be the China correspondent for CNBC, so a US network operating in China, and then for 8 years again at the English channel for the state broadcaster. So a lot changed in the media landscape in those 20 years. When I joined, the English arm of the state broadcaster was just getting started. The people who were the founding team members were very optimistic about China reforming media, and they had often, most of them had studied in the US, and the word globalization was all the rage, and it was a good word. So I was in the right place at the right time, being bilingual, having business background. I used to be an accountant in Australia. And so I got to witness China's incredible economic growth. So many CEOs came to China because they were investing in the growth story. And that continued after I left CCTV to work at CNBC. So what at the time were, for example, in 2002 and 2003, the big banned topic was Falun Gong. So then I also noticed sensitivities around the 3 Ts, Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen. But one could say that back then, the people that were managing the media landscape had all seen June 4th, and all had some aspirations of liberalizing. So then we have incredible economic growth. We have the world getting excited about China reforming. We have a lot of corruption. when I was at CNBC, I was reporting on the China story in English for CNBC, but also for the joint venture partner. So the global growth story or global markets in Chinese for for Shanghai Media Group, China's second largest media player. And I remember being told once, I was talking about I think this was 2005, I was talking about the South Korean markets being closed for Buddha's birthday. And then, and Hong Kong markets as well, I think. And then I was told by my CNBC boss that Shanghai Media Group complained that I must never mention religion on air. Even in that context, I didn't know. And around the so in the lead up to the Beijing Olympics, the censorship paranoia reached a crescendo. I actually secretly kept a copy of the propaganda notice, 宣传通知, which is brought around to all of the media outlets every day, which contains a distillation of the main topics that you must report, that you must not report, and how to report it. And I remember it was an 18-page document, everything ranging from not criticizing Putin's hairstyle to being extremely alert because there'll be over 2,000 foreign journalists coming to Beijing. And I'll always remember a line that said, be cordial to them, do not beat them up, do not confiscate their equipment, but do not let them find who they want to interview. I tried to get a photocopy, but I couldn't. And that is how the media censorship works. So there will be the top propaganda chiefs having a meeting, and then they will decide on what the masses must know and must not know and how they should interpret something. I also remember snippets like when Chinese tennis player Li Na won a Grand Slam, and she didn't thank the sports bureau or thank the party or the country. That was a big controversy. So the guideline was, do not play that up. That is, do not let people know that that is a legitimate attitude to have. I remember Carrefour, the French supermarket chain, Carrefour Chengdu employees having a union strike, do not report. So you don't want other people around the country to get the wrong idea. And the hierarchy of media censorship in China is according to how much you have and how much the state can coerce you or make up lies about you. The most dangerous group, obviously, is what they call the shoeless, 打赤脚的, people who have nothing, because this is how the communists came to power. When you have nothing, you are fearless, and you cannot make up anything about this person who has nothing, because he's not afraid of those rumors. And that is why Mandarin television is the most tightly controlled. And now, of course, that would be Mandarin online as well. And then it is Mandarin radio, because it doesn't take much education to understand the radio, or in these days could be an audio format. And then it's print media, magazines. Oh, no, not newspapers, because magazines are more expensive and harder to read. So, and then you have English or foreign language media, because to understand, you need to be well educated. And that usually means you have means. And it is easier to arrest someone who can be coerced if he or she has assets and interests like businesses. And you can say they evaded taxes. You can make up some sort of scandal so they lose, their reputation and life savings. And in 2008, I was doing a lot of reporting around the Beijing Olympics. I remember being harassed by property development company muscle, as in, bodyguards they hire to guard the areas they're going to demolish. This is inner city Beijing, so a lot of hutongs were being demolished to develop property. And as soon as we started shooting, we were basically almost pushed to the ground. And sometimes if there are severe market fluctuations and we try to shoot footage of investors, we would be harassed. And when we interviewed, or when I interviewed China's top brokerage, he wasn't the CEO, he was the research chief. And I asked, because it was 2008 during the American subprime crisis and a lot of market upheaval, and I said something along the lines of, you are basically directed by the Communist Party to do certain things in the market, to run the market. And he was so outraged by my question that he walked out, stopped the interview, and confiscated our equipment. And this is what you need to understand about even foreign media operating in China. They are also afraid. Well, firstly, for their staff safety, and then also for their business interests. So CNBC at the time was, the parent company was General Electric, which has huge investments, had huge investments in China, not sure so much now, and wanting to do more business. So they were always and they were starting to get advertisers like Bank of China, companies that were going global. So they did not want to be hauled in before the Ministry of Radio, Film and Television to be given a dressing down and maybe lose, for example, they had rights to have their channels be in hotel rooms, certain luxury hotels, the hotel chains in China. So a lot of negotiation ensued, and we got our equipment back. We didn't do that question, and that is just a little taste of the reality of being in media in China, regardless of if it's foreign-owned or state-owned. I have a lot of Chinese local journalist friends who are just heartbroken each time they do a story, an important story, and then on the way back, their chiefs would have gotten a call from the powers that be, and they need to kill that story. Or, even worse, they are told that the only nugget in that story that's worth reporting has to be cut out, and they have to use all of their brains to think of a way to still tell that nugget, but not get everyone into trouble. And that has just gotten worse under Xi. So there is a saying that you used to be able to get away with subtle criticism or light criticism, and then it was an age of if you're silent, you're safe. But now we're in an age, if you don't cheer loudly enough, you get into trouble. And I believe that is how the General Zhang Youxia was purged, for not being as enthusiastic about war as he should. So the 2000s was still rapid economic growth and internationalizing, and in some ways reforming, but then in other ways not quite moving as fast as in media as people would like. CNBC, for example, always hoped that they would be able to actually operate on the ground, but then came the 2010s and things got worse. We've seen an exodus of China correspondents. We've seen almost the disappearance of investigative reporters. So in the Chinese media industry, there were a few names that were known for quality journalism. Caijing, Caixin, the southern metropolis, Nandu, etc. But it just seems that the room for survival has got thinner and thinner. I used to know the chief at Phoenix Online, and I don't know if you're familiar with Phoenix, but this was actually set up by a sort of a princeling who, the whole idea of Phoenix TV and then Phoenix Online was to be kind of in the middle. Better news quality than state media or local media, but then not quite as free as, say, CNN or or BBC. But even they, when they ran a 40-minute commemorative video after the death of Dr. Li Wenliang, who was the whistleblower during COVID at the start of 2020, the website had to be taken down for 7 days. So how they do the punishment is that these media outlets are hauled in to the propaganda or the regulators for media, and they have points. It's sort of like a point system. I think it used to be qualitative, but then they moved to a point system, and for that they were bottom of the pile. There were other media outlets that also did specials about Dr. Li, but they were the most harshly punished, because it's seen that after she came to power, the Liu family that kind of founded Phoenix was not so much protected anymore. So you can see, while a lot of it seems to be based on rules and so-called laws, but then it also comes down to factions and personalities and personal infighting. So working at CGTN, what I experienced was, and people do ask me, in fact in 2014 I went on an Australian TV show called Q&A, which was actually recorded before a live audience in Shanghai, and that in itself is something that could never happen again. That was sort of the last window of openness in Chinese media and operating with international collaborators. And someone asked me from the audience why I was working for the state broadcaster, because they are known as the propaganda machine. And I said, I think I can actually affect change from within. And also, having had 9 years of experience working at the US channel, I thought I was bringing knowledge, sort of international, ways of doing things to CGTN. And until the day of my arrest, I still believed that I played quite a valuable role, in that because I was fluently bilingual, I was not as cautious as my American-born colleagues, who are also presenters at CGTN, because I thought I knew where the red lines were. I was a business show presenter. I thought that was pretty safe, but I also saw the creeping increase of cult worship. Almost every headline had to start with "he," and it was always in these very obsequious, sickening terms, which I would always delete, because I was a so-called foreign expert, so I could edit the scripts before they went to air. And I would always replace it with something else, with China or Beijing, and then just make it seem less disgusting. I thought my job was to make the show less shit every day. And in terms of our guests, because the show format was, there will be some reads, there will be live crosses to our reporters in the field, there would also be studio guests. And I always insisted on getting my own guests, because while there are guest bookers at the TV station, they always seem to rely on the same 4 professors. And they didn't speak very good English, they were not international they didn't understand they were speaking to an international audience. They always towed the party line, of course, and they just were really boring. So I always try to get female guests, entrepreneur guests, international guests visiting Beijing, and especially people who would tend to go on the international outlets. But then by the first Trump administration, I was already noticing the politicization of business. So there would be economists who would tell me, I'm never going to go on your channel. Or, for example, Eric Schmidt, ex-CEO of Google, told me that I would never, ever appear on your channel. And then there were always other, what the Chinese would call, grasses that sit on the wall. So they would speak in one tongue to Bloomberg or CNN, but then on CGTN they would subtly tweak their messaging to seem more China-friendly. I don't know how that works now for these guests, but I'm guessing it's just harder and harder to walk that tightrope. Sorry, I'm just gonna drink. The amount of Xi worship got to a point where in 2018 he inaugurated the so-called China Import and Export, CIIE, China International Import Expo, basically inviting all countries to come and look how big the China market is, and weaponizing trade. So it was, anything that Xi would go to was a huge priority for all of the state media. And I was looking at the number of people that CCTV as a group sent, and it was thousands of people going to cover this expo, which usually is just a business story. But because it's Xi, it has to be extensively covered. And I guess most of you know that TV ad revenues are declining. But at CCTV, which then became known as China Media Group, CMG, which encompasses China Daily and I think CRI, China Radio International, the break even, or all the CCTV Chinese channels had to break even by themselves. That's why you see so much dodgy advertising on the Chinese CCTV channels, because it's all sink or swim. But then for the foreign language CGTN Russia, CGTN French, etc., they are all funded by the propaganda ministry. And in fact, the head of CMG, Shen Haixiong, a Xi ally, is a deputy minister, if I'm not mistaken, of the propaganda ministry. So the whole term grand international propaganda encompasses all of that. I guess in reporting after the Xi era became more politicized because of these big events and all of his big initiatives like Belt and Road. And there was a lot of money spent on traveling with him, and each time there was a conference, there was this directive for the reporters to go and talk to, especially foreign faces, international attendees, to say, what did you think of Xi's speech? And they don't really have to say anything meaningful, just a lot of sickening praise would suffice. At the time, they were also opening CGTN. CGTN America was already quite successful, and then they were looking at opening the bureau in London. But I think actually someone I know very well now, because he was a former prisoner in China, Peter Humphrey, lodged complaints about CGTN and CCTV running these forced confessions on their channels, and therefore they shouldn't be allowed to have a bureau overseas. In terms of voices of resistance in the media landscape now, I have a saying, well, I heard a saying from a writer friend, and I don't know whether Tibetans overseas feel the same, is you gain the sky, but you lose the ground when you are trying to report on a place from afar. You are free, yes, physically, but you are not in touch with what's happening on the ground. So much of because I am still a very keen observer of what's happening in China, I rely on a myriad of sources, obviously in-person conversations with people who have just come back, rely on influences that are not full of very sensationalist political gossip, but talking, people who really know their stuff online, and people who have credible, mainland sources going to them with stories. I look at China's version of Quora or Reddit, which is Zhihu, which is really handy for getting a feel for how the middle class, the sort of well-educated and well-heeled parts of China think about issues. And on that, I must say they are quite less informed about Tibet than on other topics. So it's just almost all overwhelmingly negative. And it's based on the Chinese propaganda, it's based on their own visits to Tibet, where they look at the museums or the exhibits about, barbaric practices of old, and all of the derogatory labeling of the Tibetan cause seems to be swallowed by them whole, whereas they are much more skeptical about Japan, about Taiwan, about anywhere else. So I was surprised by that. There are also lots of... So the thing about China, as you know, is how deep and how pervasive the fear is for anyone who has anything to lose. I'm in a very privileged position now to have lost everything, and therefore I can speak out. But there are others as well. Like there's a former SINA censor who, I think his name's Eric Liu, who went to the US, and he has done some great work exposing how the online censoring world works. In 2014, or is it 2015, I think I was invited to a dinner where the internet censors were there, and after a couple of rounds of drinks, they were saying things like, "Oh, as long as you don't organize any activities, any events, you're okay." But now the censorship environment is so different because there are so many words, and words that sound like the words to be censored, and words that sound like the words that sound like the words to be censored, and it's just such a waste of everyone's energy and time to have to think up ways to get around the censors. So on the one hand, it shows how extreme the paranoia and fear there is, but also how there is this persistent need to resist, to tell the truth. I heard of, I don't know if those who learn Chinese know of the Cheng Yu, no, actually not that one. But there is a saying in Chinese which is, you walk along the road and you speak with your eyes. And that is a common feeling now, that there's so much that you cannot verbalize. And even when they go overseas, there are WeChat groups where you never know who is watching, taking screenshots, so people, and then reporting on people I know of someone who defected in Australia. His pseudonym is Eric, and I translated a lot of his documents, which were transcripts of his conversations, his phone conversations with his superior, and they were very chilling in that he was being paid well and being paid to go to Thailand in order to spy on some Falun Gong practitioners, and also paid to lure a cartoonist from Canada. 变成辣椒是在加拿大。
在美国。
From the
那个
US.
时候应该在日本。
Okay, from overseas to what they call a safe Asian country. So Cambodia and Thailand are seen as the backyards of China. So if you can lure them to those places, then Chinese secret police can arrest them there. And they were just talking about, there's this family who live in this apartment, go and take photos, they have a child, and somehow find out their habits. And this is just one spy story. And by his estimates, there could be over 1,000, of course, at different levels of association with the secret police. But China tries to maintain a very, very tight hold on the diaspora, because this is how they got assistance in the 50s, right? From the Indonesians and the Americans who wanted, the Chinese diaspora who wanted to come back and help the motherland. And what else can I share with you? I guess I can leave it open to questions. I feel like I've talked a lot.
It's really interesting going through all your studies.
江不熊不让下下边呢，那你都你修没了，那干什么这一把三个两个球的比起来，你去去呢，就我现在那么你都你修了就比起了，那留对当姐姐他们那个，看就看就多少钱，那俺的把这才不让下下呢，那你都就输了两个礼拜节了，后来你都就记得呢，俺这他是在中意别东西呢，你都中意翻的，你都中意呢，的人没说他忙不出来的。 那不然给提起了，这些我就来去做配药的，我就来你的配药的，像提配个简单的过来，忙配药的那么，我让我现在他给我有教是的，不然提起了不然这样的首先来，你这就可以给的，那提没能接了，他抽上来就个这这个着，那提不然跟提忙不没接，不然别人给他看了就是的。 你可以的就这种他公司的，就在那店呢，原来给吃是长的麻辣烫，他最给那个了7多钱，我说。
Thanks so much for having me today. As a Han Chinese, I feel very honored and happy to be accepted and included into the Tibetan community to speaking about those very important topics. I always feel as a Han Chinese that my own people, the Chinese government, committed so many crimes against native people like Tibetans that need to be addressed, not just by international society, but also by Chinese ourselves. So for me personally, I think it's very important that at least in my individual level, I want to do as much as I can to support the freedom and the well-being for the Tibetan community. Yes, I'm a political cartoonist, I'm a political artist, and also I have to say that, usually to be an artist is always difficult. Then to be a political artist, it just makes it much more complicated. Maybe I'll start to sharing a bit of my personal life as well. I'm actually born in a quite artistic family. My grandpa and his brother were filmmakers in China in a very early time. They will be seen as the founding members for Chinese film industry in the 1930, 40 until 50. In 1955, this is the movement called 100 Blossom, which Chairman Mao launched this basically political purge against intellectuals and artists. That is also the movement that killed my grandpa and his brother. So as you can imagine, when I grow up, when I hear those family stories, the reason why my parents share those stories to me is not to actually encourage me to be an artist, but actually to talk me away from being an artist, to avoiding repeating the tragedy of it. But by knowing those tragic memory, but it's not just tragic, it's also glory. It's also the potential that I could fulfill that making me maybe want to achieve more instead of just getting scared to be an artist, that making me want to be more. I think this is only human nature, especially for younger generation or teenage time. Thus, that kind of setting me on the path of being a artist. I always believe that to be an artist, meaning that you have to be really truthful to your life. I don't think I'm intentionally trying to be a dissident. I think being a dissident is really just a byproduct of being a truthful artist. And my art is reflective on my own family history, my understanding of China, and those people that I care. Most importantly, universal human rights. So when I eventually started to making art, I'm not naive. That I know even, it seems like China tried to tell the world it's a different one, it's more open and liberated, but it's actually not. So from the very beginning, I try to be as anonymous as possible. I don't show my face. Badiu Cao is actually an artist name. I'd be very careful to be in any public performance or speech by wearing a mask. However, this kind of disguise and being anonymous is not that easy. So after about 7 years of trying to hide myself, 3 days before my Hong Kong exhibition in 2018, the Chinese government eventually find out who I am. And what they do from that point is starting threatening my family. So they took my relatives in Shanghai to the police station, interrogated them for hours. But the reality is my relatives has no idea of my art practice. And eventually a message was sending to me via my family, and they demand my Hong Kong exhibition being cancelled in 2018. I have to emphasize this year because that is before the 2019 massive movement, that is before the national security law being introduced to Hong Kong. But by the time the Chinese National Security Police is already thinking that they can use some way to stopping freedom of speech or freedom of art expression in a city like Hong Kong, almost predicting the coming future. But this is just one of their very iconic way of using the transnational repression by threatening your family. I believe that from the Tibetan community, you are facing much harsh line of punishment and threat. And I, as Han, still have certain privileges, but that's the taste of my own thing. So I would categorize China's censorship or harassment of artists into some different categories. Firstly, from online space, that I tried to hide my trace for 7 years. But during these 7 years, I know that there must be like a task force of police in China is carefully collecting my information. So I remember the first giant wave of online campaign, a smear campaign against me, is when my a theory of portrait for Chinese feminists got arrested, got adapted by BBC and also used by Amnesty International as an urgent calling for helping. And what's coming next is that the Chinese government starting to actually building a fake artist website of me. So my artist website is badiucao.com. They actually purchased a domain as badiucao.net. And on that website, it has tons of, just like fake stories, smear campaigns saying I'm a criminal in China and I left China and escaped to Australia. That's why I have this resentment against Chinese government. It's very absurd. But what it does is, because it has this fake website, and they posting this website on social media with bots or trolling accounts massively. Thus, it polluted the search result online. So even though nobody would really buy it, but it created smoke that they know they cannot discredit your work as an art, but what they do is character assassination. And this methodology has been using against a lot of dissidents. I would like to mentioning one of my very close friend, Vicky Xu. She's also a journalist and research, used to based in Australia, and the Chinese government trying to break her to a point that they make fake pornography of her and send it to her families back in China. So again, they cannot discredit her research or report, especially her report is actually on the genocide of Uyghur community. So they're doing this, slurred accusation, character assassination in order to discredit her as a person, but also creating tremendous psychological stress as a young girl that you can imagine how bad it is. It is actually coming back to your question about how feminism is seen in China. They never, they would put like more maybe anchors on the national propaganda news, but in reality, they don't shy away to create fake pornography. So again, that just shows how much they really respect women. And apart from that, I think nowadays on online space, we're facing a tremendous threat, which is those, fake posters and mirror campaign are no longer created by human, but by AI. And it means it will be much efficient and it will be much cheaper. So if you imagine the Chinese government as a business, right? They want to benefit from this authoritarian system. And in the meantime, in order to maintaining that, they have to feed a big team for censoring, for cracking down, which means those companies will have to hire manpower to actually sitting behind the screen, to going through every tweet or Weibo or whatever. But now we're talking about in the age that AI actually have the capacity to understand as a human being, to basically decode those black words that netizens use or means. Well, now computer would understand Xi Jinping is Winnie the Pooh, so you don't really need another human being to see that. So that tremendously reduced the cost of censorship, than making it much more efficient. And again, if this goes to polluting your search results with AI, it's endless rolling. And that's also happened to me now, to my social media account. Actually, if you search my handle Badiu Cao in English or Chinese, on Twitter, you'll find hundreds of fake accounts, all registered by bots, but having my name and my background images. So that's what they're trying to do with online space. In physical space, as a dissident in Australia, I've been being followed. So after 2018, as I mentioned, that they know who I am. So after that, the harassment are just not to my family back in China, but also more directly to me. So I've been followed. I've been impersonated is another crazy case recently. Actually, associated with Cheng Lei as well. So this incident is quite bizarre. It happened last year. So after Cheng Lei came back to Australia with freedom, we didn't meet each other pretty late, but we have some exchange online. And for one of Cheng Lei's early public event,
with Vicky Xu.
With Vicky Xu, yeah. So small
With spies in the audience.
So someone impersonated me to approach to her and saying, "Hey, I'm Badiu Cao. I'm your friend. I'm a big fan. Let's exchange information." So this is beyond just digital space, but actually impersonating in a very kind of James Bond type of saga and drama is quite concerning as well, because it might sound as ridiculous, but the implication of it could be they're testing such strategy maybe in the future this fake Badiu Cao will harass a woman, and then it become a fake Me Too case against me. So the implication of it is quite large, but it's just showing that how aggressive the Chinese government is trying to pull such operation. And then for me, I guess the most frustrating part is that how China's censorship is working in the art industry to a point that preventing me to practice as an artist normally. So in my own country now, in Australia, I rarely have any opportunity to showing works. That is because Australia is economically heavily depending on China. And a lot of if we really dive into the system of, let's say, gallery system, you can divide them into public funded one and private or commercial gallery. So for the private gallery, from my understanding, a lot of galleries still operated according to your cultural background. By saying this, I would say, there are certain so-called mainstream gallery only running artists with white skin, and then you have the multicultural galleries who are dealing a lot with Asia culture or Asia art, particularly Chinese market as well. So naturally, if I'm just a regular Chinese Australian artist, I would try to seek representation of business interaction with those multicultural gallery. But in the reality, because my political practice, those galleries would worry that once they representing me, it's almost like swallowing a toxic pill, which means they will have to say goodbye to their Chinese market, collectors, or artists that they want to represent from China. So for me, on the commercial side, it is constantly being a very painful thing because non-gallery really have this courage to representing me till this day. And then the public funded institution, the story are slightly different. So the public funded institution like NGV, National Gallery of Victoria, or National Gallery in Sydney, firstly, they have a lot of donors are coming from the mining industry in Australia. And as you know, who are the biggest buyer of Australia's mining resources? China. So there is this invisible line that the Chinese government can pull through entrepreneurs or philanthropists in Australia domestically. And secondly, the Chinese government is really good at playing this game of racism accusation, right? They call me as a racist artist or xenophobia. To a point, it's really fascinating. Several years ago, I did a show in Poland, in Warsaw, and the Chinese embassy there tried to sabotage the exhibition. Fortunately, they didn't succeeded. But what they do is they went to the gallery in person, and they also posted a statement on their website of the embassy. And on their website, they call me anti-China Australian artist. So I'm no longer a Chinese Australian artist, right? My identity being stripped away from it. And then from this statement, if you just read it, you would imagine as if I'm kind of a white supremacist artist who's doing, xenophobia work. So this is the trick that they're playing. However, this game is really efficient among the culture and art people, because as you can imagine, most of ours tend to be more progressiveness, tend to be more lefty, and the last thing that we want is being labeled as a racist because we want to be like anti-colonization, anti-imperialist, right? And particularly in Australia, it is the case as well. And giving Australia's, indeed genocidal history against Native Aboriginal peoples. So naturally that I understand that the liberals and art people are afraid of being called a racist. Thus, the safe way to do it is distance from artists like me, so they don't get accused from the government as racist. And that is my struggle in the art space. And outside of Australia and actually in Europe, I have a little bit more luck. But I have to say it will not happen if I have some certain personal connection with some curators that triggering opportunity to showing in some very good national museum in Italy, in Czech Republic, in Poland. But what happened to those events is every time it is almost a guarantee that the Chinese embassy or consulate will try to sabotage the show. My experience in Italy started with the Chinese consulate in Milan, writing a letter, threatening letter, directly to the Brescia Museum, and the mayor of Brescia. Brescia is a little town about 45 minutes driving away from Milan, but it's a very important culture town for Italy. So what the Chinese government did is writing to the mayors and to the museum directly and saying this show is anti-China, hurting Chinese feeling, and they gave a price that the Italian government will pay because it says if you host Badiu Cao's exhibition, then you will be facing the consequence that damage the diplomatic relationship between Italy and China. But fortunately, that town is really brave, and I think it partially because Italians have this pride in their art that they feel is sacred. And also economically, it was not that tight. Even though Italy, it was a part of the Belt and Road Initiative, but it's no longer the case. And following that, I had another exhibition in Prague, in Czech Republic. And this time, it is not just an email to the museum or to the Foreign Ministry of Czech Republic, but also the Chinese embassy find a private number of my curator. So it is not on their website, it is a private cell phone. And I called her when we are doing the installing. And again, the same message, want the show to be canceled for your own sake, for your own safety. It's anti-China, it's hurting the Chinese feeling. And then the next experience that I have is in Warsaw in Poland. And this time it's not just email, it's not just private calling, but actually the consulate from Chinese embassy came in person to the Ujazdowski Museum in Warsaw without pre-noticement and demanding to meeting with the director and saying, I want this show to be canceled. And then at this time, what's more interesting is, I mentioned several times that hurting the Chinese feeling, this phrase. But it's always a abstract expression, right? We don't know the substance of it. And this time, this Chinese diplomat came and saying, he explained what does it mean. He's saying, hurting the Chinese feeling, meaning hurting, this tens of hundreds Chinese international students feeling in Warsaw. We don't know what they will do to your exhibition. So for your own, sake of safety and everything and avoiding protest, you should consider canceling this exhibition. Again, I'm very happy that the Chinese government didn't succeed. The show goes on. But what it tried to create, from my perspective, was this pattern that they show every time, and they're playing a long game. Because every time when they just cancel my show, try to cancel my show, and it's going on, then suddenly it becomes international news, right? You have New York Times, CNN reporting about it. But it really trying to achieve is a longer term fear. So now if any other national museum or a big gallery want to collaborate with me, it's not a probability that the Chinese government will threat. It's a certainty. So on top of all the financial burden of creating big shows, then it's a certainty that they will be harassed by the Chinese government. So how many museums or galleries really have this courage to do so? It is a big question mark. So for me, I feel like to dealing with all those difficulties that as an artist, I have to break through the conventional art venues, not just showing in a gallery, not just trying to, sell works through art fairs, but more seeking space, like online space on social media, Now, that is also why I really drive into the political cartooning form, because it's very direct, it's 2D, it doesn't cost a long time to consume, it's fitting for social media consumption. I think it was successful for a very, very long time. However, now the global social media situation has been fundamentally changed, especially after Elon Musk acquired Twitter and turned it into X. The algorithm has been changed tremendously, that simply my growing interaction has dropped to zero for a very long time. So yes, that becomes difficulty as well, without even for the Chinese people, Chinese government to lift a finger. Then another space that I'm trying to explore would be public art, street art. Because the problem is always the gatekeeper, right? Whether it's the algorithm on social media or the curators, the galleries in the museum. But in the public space, there is no such gatekeeper. The only thing is you need to be careful about the police. But there are also legal places, like in Melbourne, my hometown now. There's this very touristy downtown spot called Hosey Lane. And every day there's tons of Chinese tourists who are coming through, and also locals. So providing a natural canvas or gallery space to showing the work to the audiences that I really want to show. Of course, it's not a very economic friendly way because it doesn't really channeling income for conventional artists. But in a campaigning way or activism way, I do believe that it can be quite useful and powerful. Now I want to dive into the censorship a little bit more. I think Cheng Lei mentioned a lot about how the Chinese government is censoring words. And I think for art activism, especially visual activism, for a long time that we actually have an advantage of going around the censorship system based on vocabulary database. And that is because when you create an art language, it does not use the same vocabulary like words, right? If you do a sentence, you will always use the same words. And once that word is labeled, the whole sentence will disappear. But for creating artworks, meaning you always create something new, meaning you're always a step ahead of the database, meaning for a short period of time, you will have your works existing inside of China in the censorship system. However, I would say this advantage is crumbling also because of AI. This is how it works, right? In the old time, you need a real human intelligence to interpret a meme or political cartoon and knowing this is actually a satire instead of just, a popular movie posters. And for computer, it wasn't able to recognize it. But now with the development of AI, if it can create political meme generative, then it can also examine, analyzing, and understand a political satire, thus censoring it much more efficiently than a human being. So I feel it's kind of losing the edge for visual art in online space battling with the censorship. But I still believe in it is because I think visual language has this magic to create a paradox for the censorship system. Let me explain a little more. Again, let me use the example of Winnie the Pooh. Why Winnie the Pooh compared with Xi Jinping become so successful to a point that in China, you see Winnie the Pooh got censored, then was released from the cage, then censored again. That is because when a political taboo is engaged or intertwined with a very popular, friendly, non-toxic, mean or famous image like Winnie the Pooh, then you create a dilemma for the censorship system. In that way, if imagine you're a parent for a 4-year-old. Every night you're gonna read on your iPad about Winnie the Pooh. The next day it disappeared. Then you have to explain to your 4-year kids why. You ask yourself the question why Winnie the Pooh disappeared. So when people ask questions, you've already kind of defeating this cage of information. Then I guess the Chinese government realized, okay, this is absurd. People will ask questions. Let's just release it. Let them read the Winnie Books again. Then again, the mean slips through with this release. So for me, my goal is always trying to combine with very political tabooed information with something so common that it is unsensible in the daily life. Thus, it creates a need and more a difficulty for the censor instead of for us as activists. Yeah, I think that's pretty much I'd like to share, and I'll look for your questions.
Thank you very much. This is the environmental topic, and
Yes.
it's the false journalism which every year.
Thank you so
Thank you
much.
very much. Thank you so much. Thank you.